Hello, good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Rishi Sunak has lost one of his closest allies. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, resigned after saying on this programme he would quit if a bullying allegation was upheld. And that means the Prime Minister, who promised a government of integrity, has now lost 3 cabinet ministers in less than 6 months, which leaves, of course, an easy hit for the opposition. This is a government distracted by scandal at a time when inflation is still above 10%. Pretty dangerous, of course, with the local elections next week and a general election next year. Well, on the programme this morning, in just a moment, for the government, we'll be hearing from the new Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, the man who stepped into Dominic Raab's shoes. For Labour, we'll talk to the party's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. And with local elections 11 days away, we'll be joined live by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, that is Ed Davey. Plus, with inflation stubbornly in double digits and the price of food rising at nearly double that, we'll take a closer look at the economy with the former Bank of England chief economist, Andy Haldane. Now, back in February, when we spoke to the then Deputy Prime Minister, this is what Dominic Raab said. Will you resign?
I'm not going to start speculating on what the outcome might be. Again, you're asking me to comment on the subject matter.
I'm not asking you to comment on the subject matter. I'm asking you to find out what you will do if...
But it's a hypothetical question, Sophie,
well,
so I've got to...
2 different outcomes.
Well, look, let's see what the report says. I'm not in control.
If you're clear, then you won't resign. So what will happen if you're not cleared?
Well, allow me to respond in the right way at the right time. Of course, look, if an allegation of bullying is upheld, I would resign.
Well, in the end, he did stick to what he said on this programme, and on Friday, Dominic Raab resigned after a report that found he engaged in abuse or misuse of power to undermine or humiliate staff. Now, that means there's a new Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, whose day job is Cabinet Office Minister and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and I spoke to him just a few moments ago. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Congratulations on the new job. We'll get into the reasons for the appointment in a moment, but first, if you could just give us an update on what's happening with Sudan. France deciding to evacuate their citizens. Are we going to do the same?
Well, thank you, Sophie. And the situation in respect of Sudan is clearly a rapidly moving and complex situation. Our priority is to support British nationals. Now, the Minister of Defence is acting in support of the Foreign Office, but clearly you wouldn't expect me to comment for security reasons on the current situation in terms of movements on the ground.
Sure, I get that you don't want to get into the details of movement, but at the same time, the US has said that they're evacuating diplomats. France has come out to say they're going to evacuate nationals as well. Are we looking at evacuating citizens?
Well, as I said, we have got the Ministry of Defence is supporting the Foreign Office. You wouldn't expect me to get into what is going on at a ground level, but what I can say is that we are. First of all, what I would say is a very different situation to, for example, the situation that you saw in Afghanistan for a number of reasons. First of all, this situation has arisen very rapidly. And secondly, we just don't have the kind of scale of resources on the ground that were there in Afghanistan. But clearly, we need to make sure that we support our British nationals. At the moment, the advice to British nationals is to make sure they stay indoors, that they stay safe and that they get in contact with the Foreign Office. OK.
We'll continue, of course, talking to the government as it goes on to see if that advice changes or if there's any movement and more that you can tell us later. You're testing an emergency alarm today. What's the thinking behind it?
Well, the job of government is to keep people safe. It's the #1 job of government. And what we are doing is we're testing an emergency alert. So at 3 o'clock this afternoon, there will be a siren-like sound for about 10 seconds on people's smartphones. It's about the same volume as if your phone was ringing. What I would say to people is, this is just a test. You don't need to do anything. It's rather like the fire alarm test. Is a bit irritating at the time, But in future, people could be grateful for it because in a real emergency, this could be the sound that saves your life.
Forgive me, it feels like there hasn't been a vast amount of advertising around this, right? At 3 o'clock, when people's phones start blaring out, people are going to panic, aren't they?
Well, I don't think that's the case. We tested this, for example, in the Reading area, and there were over 140,000 people involved, and there was very positive feedback. There wasn't any panic at all. I have announced, I think, on your programme a couple of weeks ago that this thing was coming. It's very similar to what happens in other countries, whether that's the United States, whether it's Japan or Canada. They regularly test these things as well. I think it's another tool in the toolkit. I think most British people in these situations keep calm and carry on. I'm sure they'll do the same thing again. OK, now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about migration, because, to be honest, it feels as if every Sunday we have another almost identical opinion piece by Suella Braverman saying she's going to take on the courts and she's going to get tough on small boats. But there are a couple of facts I think it would be useful to try and find out ahead of the illegal migration bill coming to the Commons this week. Is the Home Secretary going to be given powers to ignore European courts if they try to stop deportations to Rwanda? Well, I think you're talking about the so-called Section 39 provisions. The Home Secretary will be given a discretion, an ability to look at the circumstances of that order from the European Court of Human Rights, and will, for example, consider factors such as the timeliness of the imposition of the order. So, for example, if it is done at last minute, and also the transparency of it. Because underlying all of this, Sophie, is the same point. And by the way, I've been out campaigning a lot. I hear this so much from people. People want us to get control of our borders, stop this vile traffic and stop the boats. And this is an important provision as part of that.
So much about the arguments for and against. I'm just trying to nail down exactly the facts, right? So there will be a discretion given to the Home Secretary to effectively ignore European court rulings.
Well, there will be a Section 39 discretion. Now, I'm not saying that will give the Home Secretary carte blanche to overall rulings. What I would say is that, first of all, we are engaging very closely with the European Court.
Some would say that's breaking international law.
We're making very good progress, but I think it's right that the Home Secretary should have a discretion. So, for example, we don't have this situation where, at the very last minute, an order is imposed. Those are the sort of factors that the Home Secretary will be able to consider.
Will there also be a move to open up more safe and legal routes? Because that's something that other people are really concerned about, that it's very difficult for people to actually legally claim asylum.
Yes, well, the first thing to say is that we've allowed over 500,000 people to come into this country.
No, I just want to get the facts.
So it's an important point of context.
I just want to get the facts.
It is an important point of context on this, which is that in this country we've been able to allow Ukrainians, Hong Kong nationals, Afghanistan nationals in. Now, of course, I want us to be able to be in a situation where we can create more routes for people to come into this country.
So are we going to be in that situation next week?
What comes first is making sure that we get control of our borders and we stop this vile trafficking of people across the English Channel, only profiting criminal gangs. Once we get control of that, stop the boats, then we will have more capacity to be able to extend our kindness and generosity as a nation, which I'm very proud of, even further.
That sounds like a no to me then. No move next week to open up more safe and legal routes to the UK. Let's move on to other issues, because, as I said, it feels like every week we're talking about this issue. Is Dominic Raab a bully?
Well, the Prime Minister asked Adam Tolley to conduct a detailed investigation. I think it was about 48 pages long. He set out the facts of what happened in a very clear way. There's nothing further I can add to that interpretation. What I can say, though, is that Dom promised that if there was an adverse finding against him, he would resign. I've worked with Dom on, over a number of years. Particularly, I remember the time when he took over from Boris when he was incapacitated. I know that Dom is a man of his word, and he resigned. And as the Prime Minister said, I think that was the right thing to have done.
He did. He made that promise on this programme that if the bullying complaint was upheld, he would resign. So if he hadn't made that commitment, do you think he would still be in a job?
Well, Sophie, that's a hypothetical situation. The Prime Minister asked Adam Tolley to conduct this investigation.
You raised it.
It was a very comprehensive piece of work. It dealt with each of the allegations against him and went into the facts of those. The situation as to whether the Prime Minister had to make a decision on that didn't arise because Dom had always promised if there was an adverse finding against him, he would resign. He's a man of his word and he's stuck by that.
Would you like to see him back in Cabinet?
Well, I think Dom has a huge amount that he has offered this country in the past. Clearly, decisions as to who is in the Cabinet or not are purely the preserve of the Prime Minister.
Now, Dominic Raab has blamed activist civil servants who are trying to block reforms. And in The Observer today, it says the government's considering allowing ministers greater powers to appoint their own civil servants. Do you think there is a case for that?
Well, we keep all of these things under review. I think it was actually an article by Francis Maud, who was a predecessor in the Cabinet Office. And I think it's important that we look at civil service appointments on an ongoing basis. But I'm pretty confident that at the moment, ministers are able to give clear instructions to civil servants and to get things done. And that has to continue. And I can say that certainly there won't be any dropping of my high standards from the civil servants that work for me. And the reason for that is that we're here to serve the British people and we must continue to do that.
Do you think that Raab is wrong then, Mr Raab is wrong then to talk about the civil servants in the way that he does? Because he is talking, right, about activist civil servants. He's effectively saying that they're out to get him.
Well, I didn't live Dom's experience. I've served both as an advisor in the past and for a number of years as a cabinet minister. I've always found that if you give clear instructions to civil servants, of course you can have frustrations, and believe me, I've had my frustrations as well. But I've also seen, for example, I think that at the height of the COVID crisis, when all of our theatres were locking down, my civil servants worked relentlessly with me to get that £2 billion cultural recovery fund. Civil servants can deliver, but I do not want to see any diminution in the ability of ministers to expect high standards of their officials, because in the end we're serving the British people and we must continue to do that.
I mean, it's important to say that some of the complaints against Dominic Raab said that he behaved in an intimidating fashion with unreasonably and persistently aggressive conduct. When you've spoken before about a painful woke psychodrama, do you think the reaction to Dominic Raab is an example of the painful woke psychodrama?
Well, I think there are many challenges with woke, and you've seen many speeches from me in the past on that. I think in respect of the civil service, what I have seen is that if you give clear instructions to civil servants, you can expect them to respond to that. And I don't want to see any change in that, because it is essential that we deliver for the British people.
I want to talk about this quite seriously now, because there have been 9 Justice Secretaries since 2015. That's more than one a year. And I think we can just look now at the state of the Crown Court backlog. I mean, the latest figures put the backlog of cases at over 60,000. There's no sign of this coming down. And I guess the concern here is that this is yet another Conservative government distracted by scandal and not getting to grips with the really pressing issues that the country is having to face.
Well, what I would say is I think that, and I don't think anyone disputes this, that Dom Raab did a very effective job as the Justice Secretary, and there's an excellent successor in the form of Alex Chalk, who has many years of legal experience.
There's huge issues
the context
in the
of this, Sophie, I think, as you and all...
And the merry-go-round is not helping.
I think, as you and all your viewers will know, there is a reason for this high level of backlog, which is the inability of the courts to operate as normally during the
That's
COVID
not true, because the backlog started
the
backlog started before the pandemic.
Of course, there were challenges, but it has been made a lot worse by COVID. We are working through it. For example, extending court hours, the continuing digitalisation process for our courts. So work is ongoing on that. There are deep problems which we're seeking to address. I don't think that the change in the person of the Lord Chancellor or Justice Secretary is going to impact that.
I mean, I guess you say that it shouldn't impact it. People will draw their own conclusions, because it does feel that we are effectively spending so much time and energy talking about these ongoing kind of scandals, if you like. Another, the findings from the review into the appointment for the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, due imminently. Now, of course, you'll say this is a matter for the BBC, but it's not that simple, is it? Because concerns around the appointment of Richard Sharp are about the fact that he failed to declare his involvement in facilitating a loan to Boris Johnson, who went ahead to recommend him for that job. If there is found to be wrongdoing in that process, should he step down?
Well, Sophie, you won't be surprised for me to say to you that there is this ongoing investigation into the nature of his appointment, and I'm certainly not going to preempt that by saying how Richard Sharp should respond to it. What I will say is that as the Secretary of State responsible for his appointment, I think we as a department ran the appointment process well. We ran it transparently, and I have every confidence that the inquiry will uphold that process as being the right one.
It wasn't that transparent, was it? Because he didn't declare the loan. He's admitted himself and have had to apologise for it. Also, concerns about the recruitment process were raised before. When you were Culture Secretary, as you say, in October 2020, there was a letter from the former BBC chairman, Sir David Clementi, to you, who said, "The committee is also concerned about the appointment of my successor as chair. We were concerned about the very strong press reports that the government, even before the job had been advertised, was in discussion with a preferred candidate, including discussion about salary." I mean, you can see how this looks. And I know this wasn't about Richard Sharp itself, but you can see how this looks, right? The government trying to press its own candidates on, people who it agrees politically with. Some would worry that this is them effectively trying to control the BBC. How did you respond to this letter?
Well, as you often do on this show, and I don't blame you, you flash up something on the screen behind me, and unless you want me to pause for about 10 seconds to read it fully.
This is the letter from Sir David Clementi raising concerns about the
if you give me a moment
process.
to finish. This is why there has been an inquiry set up into the conduct of the appointment. I have every confidence that it was a transparent and open process. In terms of this idea that somehow the Conservatives are packing public appointments, most of the complaints that I found when I was responsible for public appointments several years ago, that it was still the same old merry-go-round of Labour cronies who were managing to get top public appointments. I don't think the facts bear out that somehow Conservatives are skewing the public appointments process. I really don't think that's the case.
OK. So we've got concerns about Dominic Raab, concerns over the BBC, and obviously to really smooth things over to show that this is a scrupulous government that's above any scandal, Boris Johnson is reportedly about to put his own father into the honours list. I mean, that is astonishing, isn't it?
Well, Sophie, you really wouldn't expect me to comment on the honours process. That's an independent process, which I'm not in any way going to comment on.
That's the whole problem, right?
There is a set process whereby former prime ministers are able to nominate people that they wish to have honours, and then that goes through a proper process.
Even if they're family members?
I cannot say one way or the other on that, so please don't take it one way or the other. There is a proper process for that.
Do you not think it would look a bit odd if the father of a former prime minister was given an honour by his son?
Well, Sophie, you're putting forward a hypothetical.
It's not that hypothetical. I'm not just plucking this out of thin air.
I think actually we saw with the investigation into the conduct of Dom Raab, there was an awful lot of speculation that turned out not to be the case in the end. And it's for precisely that reason that I don't respond to speculation.
Understood. OK, well, voters are going to have a chance to make their thoughts clear on all this very soon. There are local elections in England and Northern Ireland in a few weeks. And, of course, you resigned as Conservative Party chair last year in June. I can't believe that wasn't even a year ago, after some bad election results. You said someone must take responsibility. I just want to have a look at the polling over that time, because you can see that the polling is actually now worse for the Conservative Party than it was when you resigned. If it's this bad in the local elections, do you think Greg Hands, the party chairman, should have to resign as well?
Well, first of all, and I really found this when I was party chairman, polls come and go, they go up and down. The key things are the tests of the British people. And there'll be a test of the British people on the May the 4th, on that election day, and let's wait and see what the results are from that. Of course, it's a challenging backdrop. Overall, the Conservatives are still broadly in a mid-term situation. And when we previously fought those seats, we were in a different position. So there is an expectation of about 1,000 or so seats lost. But what I would say is that my experience of working with Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister is he has brought a calmness and a stability and an order to government. He's methodically dealing with problems. And I'm finding that people are responding positively to that. Of course, there are challenges, and of course, there's a way to go. But I feel that we are heading in the right direction, and I hope that the British people will respond to that in those elections, but which, of course, are also, I should say, on local issues primarily.
Thank you very much indeed. Oliver Dowden there, the new Deputy Prime Minister. Well, we were just talking there, weren't we, about the local elections. We can get the view from Labour now because the party is going to be hoping to turn those big poll leads we were looking at into concrete success at the coming local elections in England, and there are also ones going on in Northern Ireland as well, of course. Well, let's speak now to the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, shall we, Jonathan Ashworth. Good to have you on the programme. I just want to start, if I may, with Sudan, because there's going to be lots of our viewers who can be very concerned about the situation there. France already beginning to evacuate its citizens. It didn't feel like, from that interview with Oliver Dowden, that the government in the UK has any plans to do so. He said that we simply don't have the scale of resources on the ground in Sudan as we did in Afghanistan. Would that be a mistake?
Well, it's deeply concerning what we're hearing from Sudan, and I'm very fortunate as a Leicester MP to represent a small Sudanese community. I know people are deeply, deeply troubled and alarmed at what they're seeing and what we're hearing from Sudan. As to the question around evacuations and so on, it does seem a legitimate question as to why our government is not acting in the same way that other governments are acting. I hope we can have a clarification from the Foreign Office, perhaps in Parliament, in the coming days on that front.
The other, well, we'll wait and see what that does, whether they do that. As Mr Dowden said, it's a very fast-moving situation on the ground in Sudan. We were also talking about the illegal migration bill that is due to come to the House of Commons next week. Just to clarify, how is Labour going to be voting on that?
Well, of course, we don't think that this illegal migration bill is going to resolve the problems, although we have put down amendments around those who have come to the UK via the Channel crossings and are terror suspects. We believe there should be a duty upon the Home Secretary to find those terror suspects and deport them immediately. So we'll be interested to see if Conservative MPs vote for our amendment. But more broadly, of course, we don't think this legislation is going to fix the problem. To fix the problem, you really have to go after these criminal gangs and people smugglers. You need to have a very specialist agency, properly resourced. That is something that Yvette Cooper has been pushing for. But of course, we want to deal with these people traffickers who are bringing people across the Channel because at the moment they're getting away with it, and that is not right.
Of course, no one's been actually deported to Rwanda yet because it's been snarled up in the courts so far. And what was very clear from Oliver Dowden this morning was that there is going to be new powers given to the Home Secretary to ignore what he would say last-minute requests from the European Court to try and stop deportation flights. Does Labour think it's acceptable for European courts to be able to overrule decisions made in the UK?
Well, of course, the Home Secretary has sent more journalists to Rwanda than actual migrants. It's not a scheme that is going to work. It's why we've said we shouldn't be going ahead with that scheme, and we should be using the money that would be saved from that, and millions and millions and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to already be spent on this scheme.
Though, if I may, the specific question was about
no, we should always follow.
European
we should always follow the law. Well, of course, we should always follow the law. We shouldn't be acting outside of the law. But the point is that scheme is not working quite self-evidently because, as I say, the Home Secretary has actually sent more journalists to Rwanda, and we should use the resources that have been ploughed into that scheme to invest in a specialist crime agency to really go after these criminal people trafficking gangs. I've seen very senior Tory MPs tweet, there'll always be these criminal gangs, there'll always be people traffickers, why go after them? I think that is just unbelievable to give these criminals a free pass. Labour would get tough and would deal with these criminal gangs.
I guess the difficulty is, saying that you'll get tough and saying that you'll deal with the gangs, that's the easy bit. It's pretty difficult, isn't it, to actually prosecute or even find the people traffickers. What the government would argue is that at least they're trying to do something. What is Labour's plan other than to smash the gangs? Which sounds easy, but is much more difficult in practice.
But we're prepared to put the resources into a specialist criminal police investigatory force to deal with our international allies. The Conservatives say they're trying to deal with it. Well, what have they done? They're not doing anything. And actually, we keep getting press releases and op-eds from ministers and Tory cabinet ministers parading around studios saying they're dealing with this. And actually, they never do. They're more interested in grabbing headlines than actually dealing with the problems on the ground. We've got a plan. We'd start by going after those criminal gangs with our specialist police force. We'd also deal with the backlog in the asylum system as well, because there's a huge backlog in claims. What are the government doing in response? They just chase headlines week after week.
Right, let's look, shall we, at the other big story of the week, which is the resignation of Dominic Raab after that report into his behaviour at the Ministry of Justice and also at the Foreign Office. Now, he has said that he believes that some civil servants were effectively out to get him, that they were, in his words, activists who were trying to block reforms. How concerned should we be that a senior minister is saying this about the civil service?
Well, look, first of all, let me say this. There's no problem with being demanding or inquisitorial or pushing the system hard. I want to be the Work and Pension Secretary. I want to be demanding and push the system to get people into good, well-paid jobs, to lift children out of poverty, to help the disabled people, 1 million extra disabled people in poverty. I want to push hard and be demanding to give pensioners security. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the report found that Dominic Raab was intimidating, aggressive, and it's not just that he was a bullying minister, he was also a failing minister, failing to deal with the backlog in the courts, failing to deal with the problems in the criminal justice system. And indeed, his failures with the criminal justice system, I think, are symptomatic of a failing government who, after 13 years now, all of our public services are on their knees and failing. So look, it's right that Dominic Raab has resigned. It calls into question Rishi Sunak's judgment in appointing him, and I think it's now the third cabinet minister he's lost. So there is a serious questions about as to why Rishi Sunak appointed him in the first place. But my biggest concern is the failing ministers and their failure in government.
I just wonder, do you think we're at a bit of a watershed moment when it comes to workplace culture? I mean, I remember a very, senior Labour politician in years gone by who people said they'd witnessed him throwing pens, staplers, shoving a printer off a desk. Things just, and obviously it's worth saying that none of this was at all directed towards Dominic Raab. But do you think our standard for what is acceptable in the workplace has changed?
I mean, people should not feel intimidated. People should not be bullied. People should not be treated in a way in which humiliates them in the workplace. But there are many, many ministers in this government who don't have complaints about them. So it is possible to be a government minister and not bully your staff. But as I say, there is nothing wrong with being demanding. I will be demanding, if I'm the Work and Pension Secretary, to get people into good, well-paid jobs and lift children out of poverty. So it's right to be demanding when you're serving the British public. But my biggest concern here isn't just that we have a bullying minister, we also have failing ministers. And, we've got a government which is failing across the board, not just on public services, but a government that is putting up tax on working people, that is forcing people or leaving people abandoned without the help that they need within this desperate cost of living crisis. And, of course, the biggest failure of all was when they crashed the economy last year and millions of families are now paying more for their mortgages or in rent. So we've got a government which is forcing the British public to pay the price for their 13 years of failure.
Well, that's your pitch, I guess, isn't it? The local elections, we just heard you give it there. I'm sure the government would question some of what you are saying there. It's a test for Keir Starmer, isn't it, these set of local elections coming up. If he wants to be the next Prime Minister, he needs to show that he can turn the poll lead that he has into actual seats at a proper poll. What would be a good night for Labour?
Well, look, I'm not a psophologist, and nor am I going to offer.
You've been around the block a bit. You know how these elections work. Come on.
I've certainly been around a long time, and you'll also know that politicians who've been around a long time don't make predictions ahead of the election, because the only polls are the ones on polling day. But what I would say is this. What we're seeing from the government is a sort of last-gasp government who cannot be trusted with the future nor make amends for their 13 years of failure. They cannot be trusted on tax. They cannot be trusted on living standards. They cannot be trusted with people's mortgages, and they most certainly cannot be trusted with the criminal justice system and the National Health Service. And as I go around the country talking to people, I have a sense that people have had enough of the Conservatives and their 13 years of failure.
OK, well, we'll find out, won't we, what happens at those local elections. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Jonathan Ashworth there from Labour.
Thank you.
Well, you're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Busy show for us this morning. The new Deputy Prime Minister, only a few days after getting that surprise appointment, shall we say, he is giving the tour of the TV studios, trying to set out the position of the government. Well, let's talk now, shall we, to Sam Coates, because as usual, The Take follows this programme just after 9:30, where we can analyse the interviews, talk through our news lines, but we can get a bit of a reaction now from Sam. Sam, anything in particular standing out for you this morning?
Oh, absolutely, Sophie. Listening to Oliver Dowden, who's now been Deputy Prime Minister for 48 hours, I just think the sort of essay question is, does this government turn a blind eye a bit too much? I've been reading this weekend the new book about Boris Johnson by the eminent historian Anthony Seldon, and I'm very struck by two sentences about when Dominic Raab took over from Boris Johnson because Boris Johnson was in hospital. One number 10 official told Anthony Seldon, in advance we were warned about Raab's bullying and shouting. That was years ago, years before Rishi Sunak appointed Dominic Raab Deputy Prime Minister. Yet here we are today fighting over quite what nuance the report might have been right. Listening to Oliver Dowden, there's also a sense that he doesn't want to get involved in talking about Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC. He was the culture secretary when that appointment was waved through, but did that appointment follow the rules? He didn't want to talk about whether or not Boris Johnson's dad's going to get a peerage. He said that's a hypothetical. Do voters think that people like Oliver Dowden can just brush off questions like this about how they acted in the past, how they acted under Boris Johnson's regime, perhaps, or do all of these relevant issues remain relevant as we head to the polls next week?
Yeah, it does feel, doesn't it, that these things are kind of layering up slightly, which gives it a different amount of emphasis. Sam, thank you very much for your analysis. We'll hear more from Sam later on this morning. Still to come on the programme as well. In just a moment, we are going to be talking to this man, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, ahead of those local elections. Plus, a little later, we're going to hear from the former chief economist at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane. I always love doing these interviews with people who are not, as you say, on the political front line, because I feel like they can talk a bit more openly about what they really think about, for example, the state of the economy. Well, with those council elections in England just 11 days away, we can turn to a party now that has built much of its success on local campaigning. The Lib Dems will be particularly hoping to take votes from the Conservatives and then translate that to a Westminster election next year. Well, we can talk now to the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey. Thanks for being on the programme. Well, we just heard Jonathan Ashworth saying that, look, if you're an experienced politician, you won't get drawn into making predictions. I'll see if I have any more luck with you. What's a good night for the Lib Dems in the local elections?
Well, I think we can make really good gains, actually, Sophie. The last time these seats were fought, we made big gains. We made over 700 gains 4 years ago in these particular council wards. But I've been going up and down the country. I've been to Stockport and Greater Manchester. I've been to Hull in North Yorkshire. I've been down to Lewes and Eastbourne, all around the country. And what we're hearing on the doorsteps is lifelong Conservatives really quite cross. They feel they've been taken for granted. They feel that the government is out of touch, whether it's on the cost of living crisis or the NHS crisis, and they feel that the Liberal Democrats are coming up with really good ideas. They like our candidates who are sort of really good local activists who represent their areas really well. So I'm feeling very positive that the party's got momentum, and I think we will make good gains.
OK, well, that's the pitch. You were pretty clear at your election launch what the plan to get there is. You were sort of pictured driving a tractor through a blue wall, so obviously got on the Conservative blue wall of seats in your sights. Are you going to go after Dominic Raab?
Well, Dominic Raab ought to resign as an MP and face a by-election, and if he's not prepared to do that to enable his constituents in East and Walton to have the MP they deserve, I think the government should withdraw the whip from him. Otherwise, they're sending a message that bullying is somehow OK in the Conservative Party. But when it comes to the local elections, there's the Elmbridge District Council elections in his constituency. I think we will make big gains from the Conservatives in those council elections. And at the next general election, we will defeat Dominic Raab.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like there's a kind of tactical question for the Lib Dems about which kind of voters you go for. And it's very clear from the launch and listening to what you say that you do see Conservative seats as a particular target. So does that mean, are you to the right or to the left of the Labour Party?
We are putting forward a Liberal Democrat position, whether it's on the economy, dealing with the cost of living. We were the first party to argue for...
If I may, I'm just going to jump in, because I do kind of feel if you can't answer that question, some people will be asking, what is the point of the Liberal Democrats? You've got to cut through. You're a smaller party, the third biggest party. You've got to have a clear message, surely. That's always when you've done best on things such as the Iraq War. You can't even tell me if you're to the right or the left of Labour.
No, we have a very clear message. You're defining it in terms of left and right. I'm not accepting that definition. I'm saying we have positive policies on the economy to help people with their energy bills, to help businesses who are struggling with their energy bills. We've got really distinctive policies on the health service. Let me give you one. Everyone knows that in order to sort out the NHS, we've got to sort out social care. There's 165,000 vacancies in social care. Only the Liberal Democrats have put forward an idea that there should be a special minimum wage for carers, £2 an hour extra on top of the national minimum wage to deal with that crisis. Because if we deal with the crisis in social care, Sophie, that will help a lot of patients be discharged from hospital. They're waiting days, weeks in hospital when they should be going out because there's not the carers to look after them. That puts extra pressure on the NHS. It wastes money and is not good for those patients. So Liberal Democrats are coming up with really attractive policies on our health services, on the economy, and that's distinctive from both the other parties.
I mean, I absolutely concede that social care is a hugely important thing in this country. But I guess my question is, at a time when you need to cut through as a smaller party, is a bit more money for carers really going to do that? If you look at the latest polling, for example, you can see the Labour Party doing very well compared to the Conservative Party in the polling. The Lib Dems, I mean, you're still kind of bumbling along the bottom, and I'm trying hard to differentiate your line there between all the other smaller parties.
Well, Sophie, when we get to actual elections, which I think is really what matters, we are cutting through big time. So the local elections last year, which party made the biggest gains? And these elections were across England, Scotland and Wales. It was the Liberal Democrats making the most gains. At 3 parliamentary by-elections in the last 2 years, in true blue areas, like in Cheshire and Amersham and Buckinghamshire, it was the Liberal Democrats who beat the Conservatives. In North Shropshire, a seat the Tories have held for 200 years, we cut through and we won that seat. In East Devon, in Tiffin-Honiton last summer, we overturned a majority, the biggest majority ever overturned at a parliamentary by-election in British electoral history. We were getting cut through and beating the Conservatives. And what I'm seeing as I go around the country and talk to people, we are the ones who are getting those lifelong Tories switching to us. And in vast swathes of the country, both of the council elections in May and the general election, whenever it comes, presumably next year, it's Liberal Democrats who are the ones who are best placed to beat the Conservatives, and we will get that cut through and beat those Conservatives.
Looking ahead to next year, the general election, which does feel quite unpredictable, if Labour falls short of an outright majority, would the Lib Dems enter a coalition with them?
Look, Sophie, my job, as far as I've said throughout my leadership, is to beat Conservative MPs. We have a positive Liberal Democrat agenda, and that's what we'll be standing on. And, when I go around the country and talk to voters, they feel the Conservatives have taken them for granted. Liberal Democrats are not going to make that mistake. We're going to work really hard to make sure we get as many Liberal Democrat MPs back after the next election and beat as many Conservative MPs as possible. I could not have been clearer.
Well, you haven't been that clear in answering the question that I posed, which is, would the Lib Dems go into coalition with Labour?
Well, Liberal Democrats' job is to beat Conservatives in the next election. There are one or two seats where we're up against Labour, like Sheffield Hallam, but the vast majority of seats that we can win in the next election, in my judgment, are against the Conservatives. And I want to focus relentlessly on that. I think the Conservatives have let down our country very, very badly. That's what Conservative voters are telling us, whether it's on the economy, on the health service, or on the environment, for example. I mean, here's an issue we've been cutting through, Sophie. The outrageous way that the Conservatives have allowed water companies to pump their filthy sewage into our rivers and seas has really, really angered many, many people. And it's been the Liberal Democrats leading on that campaign in Parliament, in the local elections. And I'm delighted that many parts of the media are now following where the issue that Liberal Democrats have first put on that table.
Okay.
That's the sort of thing, if you vote Liberal Democrat, you're going to get a strong position on the environment.
OK, I'm very clear where you are on the water. I'm still not clear about whether you'd enter a coalition with Labour, because some would say that, look, if you really want to make impact on things such as the environment, then you've got to be in government. Would you enter a coalition with Labour? It's a really clear question.
Yeah, and I'm giving you a clear answer. The more
really
Liberal Democrat MPs that get elected...
I really don't understand.
No, because I want people to vote Liberal Democrat to both to beat Conservative MPs and to get Liberal Democrat policies. And I've outlined a number of those policies to you today. And that's the job of political parties, surely, is to stand on a set of policies, on a set of values, and put them into the electorate and hopefully win seats. So MPs can do that in Parliament.
If you don't feel able to answer the question about whether you'd enter a coalition, just say, look, I'm not going to answer that question, because I'm trying to work out if I'm supposed to be reading between lines here or if I just don't get it. Would you enter a coalition?
No, it's quite clear, Sophie, because when I go up and down the country talking to people on the economy, on the health service, on the environment, that's not what people are asking me. They're asking me, how are you going to deal with our problems? Yeah, I know you are, but what I feel is that Liberal Democrats and all politicians, frankly, should respond to the electorate, make it clear where they stand on those issues, and not take voters for granted. I mean, in many ways, your question is taking voters for granted. And I'm not going to do that. I want to make sure that we earn people's vote over the weeks and months ahead, so at the next general election we can get rid of this shocking government who's failing our country, is just so out of touch with people who can't afford food bills, can't afford their energy bills, and are desperately trying to get that hospital treatment they need.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Ed Davey there, outlining his pitch ahead of the local elections. We'll be talking to the Greens next week, if you're wondering whether or not. A few people asked me on social media, so we'll be talking to them ahead of the local elections on the programme next week. Now, Rishi Sunak says that he will halve inflation as one of his 5 pledges to voters. The problem is that this week, of course, we found out prices are still rising by more than 10% a year, and food inflation is almost double that, so really difficult for lots of people. And the economy isn't growing either, which means we're getting poorer. And it is, of course, bad news for struggling families, but it's also potentially difficult for the government. Now, Andy Haldane used to be chief economist at the Bank of England. He's now the chief executive officer of the Royal Society of Arts. I spoke to him this week. Thank you so much for being on the programme. It's great to talk to you today. So you've just been appointed by the Chancellor onto his economics advisory panel. I'm interested to know, given the kind of economic landscape we're in, what would be your number one piece of advice to politicians now?
Hi, Sophie. I think you can't look much further than growth right now. We haven't got any, just at the moment. It's been anemic now for the better part of 15 years and counting. That makes all choices difficult.
It feels to me like growth has become almost a bit of a dirty word after the Liz Truss mega budget. How do you get growth in a responsible way?
Yeah, well, I think the key word there is responsible and sustainable and inclusive. So I think, what went wrong last year with the dash for growth is it wasn't seen as being a sustainable plan for growth.
So what would that look like then?
Well, I think ultimately this is about expanding how we produce as a country rather than what we consume as a country. It's about more people being in the workforce, and it's about those people producing more. That's the way we grow our capacity to produce as a country. What's sometimes called the supply side of the economy. Stimulating spending is dead easy, but ultimately it's what we produce that determines long-run growth.
And is there any sort of kind of specific policies that you point to that could be helpful?
Yeah. So think of it in two bits. So roughly speaking, economics, dead simple. You can expand the economy either by growing the workforce or by making that workforce more productive. Okay. So on the first, what can we do to expand our workforce? Bearing in mind, Sophie, our workforce has contracted over the past couple of years by about 500,000 people. That's why we've got 1 million unfilled vacancies. That's why every sector and every region is screaming blue murder about an absence of staff. What could we do to expand the numbers of people available and in work? Well, immigration is one safety valve, ruled out by both parties, but is
rightly ruled out or wrongly?
I think given the scale and spread of skill shortages, for not operating a little bit to alleviate those through skilled, controlled migrant labour is a mistake.
Inflation is obviously a huge concern alongside growth, something that all of our viewers are going to be feeling.
Yeah.
What's your, I mean, we've seen the figures out, obviously, still above 10%. How difficult do you think the outlook is for inflation, or is it going to get better?
So it's been a very, very difficult 18 months, let's be absolutely clear. We've got inflation still in double digits, and growth pretty much at zero. That's the wrong place on both fronts. That's the bad news, and it is bad news because we've seen the biggest squeeze on household budgets over the past 18 months, as we've seen since the 50s, actually. Very difficult position. The good news is I think from here, from around the second half of the year, things will begin to improve gradually, but they will begin to improve. Why do I say that? The world's getting a bit better. Not loads better, but a bit better. It's getting its mojo back, and that will help us sell more of our stuff overseas. The big cause of that squeeze on living standards has been high inflation, as you mentioned. That will begin to head south pretty soon, probably starting next month actually, and at a rate of knots. Because the biggest single reason why it's picked up to 10% plus is because of high energy prices, and they have now come off at a real rate of knots over the course of the past 6 months. And that will start to show up in headline rates of inflation starting pretty soon. And you fast forward 6 months, I think the headline inflation rate will not be double digits, it might be 3, 4 or 5.
So Rishi Sunak's target then to halve inflation, that looks pretty safe.
Pretty much nailed on.
A lot of what I'm hearing from the government is, look, we have to have pay restraint because that fuels inflation. So increasing pay, as obviously lots of people in the public sector want to see, is a bad thing for the economy. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a question of balance there. It's certainly true that one of the biggest single sources of inflation is how much workers are paid. That's just a matter of the cost arithmetic facing businesses. And a degree of moderation, whether in the setting of wages, but also in the setting of prices by businesses, is necessary right now, given that as a country, we are somewhat poorer. Basically, the price of stuff that we buy from overseas has gone up a lot, energy and food. And that means as a country, we are somewhat poorer. And the pain of that has been felt by workers through pay, and to an extent, by businesses in the form of reduced profits and higher costs. Nonetheless, there is no question that the way we grow as a country is by having people's pay packets rising, not falling over time. And that, I hope and expect, we'll see second half of the year.
I'm interested to talk to you about interest rates and mortgages as well. Obviously, you used to work at the Bank of England. How concerned are you about what is happening when it comes to interest rates? How high do you think they might go?
Yeah, so we've seen them rise from almost nothing to now, 4.25%, which is a pretty chunky rise in a relatively short space of time, and a surprise to lots of people. The big question is what happens next? I mean, truth be told, even the rise so far, Sophie, has not been felt in most people's mortgage payments so far. Many are on fixed rates, and those fixed rates haven't reset yet. And I say all of that because the effects of the tightening seen so far haven't fully been felt. And that would personally, had it been back in my old job at the Bank of England setting interest rates, which was my previous life for 7 years, that would give me cause for pause. I think, hang on, the economy is still on unsteady legs right now. Much of the tightening that's already happened hasn't yet hit people's bank accounts. Perhaps now's the time to press the pause button and see what happens.
Because of people's pain in the mortgage rates and because it's going to become difficult for them in this year.
Well, having faced a cost of living squeeze, if you're rising the cost of borrowing as well as the cost of living, that compounds the agony.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure right now whether businesses or households are ready for the double whammy of those two things. So personally, I'd be thinking hard about pausing. Equally, I think it's likely the bank will feel the need to keep on rising further, and financial markets feel the same, because those price pressures and those wage pressures remain well above the bank's 2% target.
I want to talk to you about levelling up as well. You're chair of the Levelling Up Advisory Council. It's one of those phrases that is so common. We hear it all the time. We had a whole election campaign around it, and both sides of the House are using it. What do you think levelling up actually means? What is that about?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's someone who grew up in a poor place in the north. It's about unlocking the potential.
Where did you grow up?
In Yorkshire, just north of Leeds. I was born in Sunderland, a place that isn't doing well, hasn't been doing well for 70 years. So I know what levelling up feels like. And I know what success looks like. You know, in my prior life at the Bank of England, I spent most of my time walking around the country, seeing the economy firsthand. Places doing well, of which there are many right now, and places, Sophie, doing far less well. So it's definitely an achievable goal. It's also a desirable one. This is about unlocking the potential in people and in places, which is very, very considerable. What are the ingredients for success is probably your next question. Some we are seeing, I think, the solution doesn't lie in Whitehall hands. It doesn't lie in central government's hands. It must lie in local hands. This will only happen locally if it's led by local people. So the devolution agenda, the proliferation of mayors, I think is really, really important. And on that, both parties are now leaning heavily in to giving more power back to the people.
It's interesting talking about your own sort of journey from Sunderland to some of the wealthiest individuals and companies and areas of the United Kingdom. And for many people, they would say that to enable that journey to happen for more people, you need to look at education.
Yeah.
Do you think politicians are taking education as seriously as they should?
No, I don't. I think we are not having a conversation about education and learning. And we need to. We know that without that, we are pushing money and water uphill. So absolutely, we need to build out the skill-based from the earliest of years through to a lifelong basis to create, we are chronically short of people and skills in this country. More than 10 million people in the workforce do not have the skills they need for the workplace. Half of all school kids leave school loathing learning rather than loving it. That is the worst endowment possible. The one thing you really want, above all else, for our education system to do is to embed a love of learning. Because if you love it, you'll keep on doing it.
What's your idea about maths to 18? Is that a good idea?
So we are an enumerate nation, and the Prime Minister's absolutely right about that. I'm the Vice Chair of National Numeracy. We'd expect me to say it's a real positive, and it is a real positive. But one, it's not about mathematics as currently taught. This is about basic number skills. Can I add up? Can I subtract? Can I make numbers for real and helping me live my life? Pay for my mortgage, pay for my grocery bill. But it's also about other things. It's not just about STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. It's also about putting the A into STEM and making it STEAM. That is to say, arts and humanities. What will protect us from the rise of the machine, from the rise of AI, is our creative capacity as human beings.
And yet that's often the first thing to be cut in budgets.
And has been. We've seen the dwindling budgets for arts and humanities, the dwindling number of people, young people, taking arts and humanities. And that's a mistake. That's a big mistake for the jobs and skills of tomorrow.
Really interesting stuff there from Andy Haldane. I thought the reflections he had about AI and how it actually could be creative skills that people value was quite interesting. Maybe I would say that as an English literature graduate, but who knows. Let's reflect, shall we, on what we've been talking about this morning now. We can also look ahead to the political week to come. Lots on the agenda, of course, with the build-up to the local elections and an important court battle over those potential Rwanda deportations. Well, let's introduce two people that you may be familiar with if you've been watching the show over the last month or so. Two women who certainly know their way around Westminster, former political advisor to Labour, Aisha Hazarika, and Salma Shah, who was a special advisor to the Conservative Home Secretary, Sajid Javid. Lovely to have you on, both of you. I want to talk, if I may, about Dominic Raab to start. It feels like everyone has thrown in their 2 cents on this, and the reaction to the poll almost splits down culture war lines. But from two people who really know what it's like to be working in government, in the civil service as well, I'm interested in that relationship between ministers and the civil service. Has it broken down? Is there a problem there? What's your view?
So I think the relationship between ministers and civil servants is actually quite dysfunctional generally. And you're right, there is this kind of like culture war split about who's on, Dominic Raab's side and who's on the civil service side. And that is not the right conversation to have, in my view. There's a couple of steps back from this, which is, how have we ended up in a situation where people don't feel that they're able to either direct their civil servants to do what they're supposed to do, be held accountable by Parliament and by the electorate? And how are civil servants in a position where they don't feel that they can talk back? And there was a really interesting article in The Sun from an insider, anonymously written, about the state of the Ministry of Justice. And there was something that really struck me, which was there are failings in our system that we are not addressing. And instead of doing things like that, we're actually talking about what is essentially, a difficulty at the top, rather than the real policy guts of what needs to be done in order to fix our prison system, for example. So I think we all need to take a bit of a step back and reflect on, really, where is this dysfunction and how are we going to fix it?
I think my perspective is slightly different. I mean, I started life off as a Whitehall civil servant, and then I became a political advisor. So I've kind of been on both sides here. And I think, for me, it's a sign of a really mediocre, failing minister to be at war with your civil service. Now, the civil service, most civil servants want to have a good relationship with their minister. They like that proximity to power. They want to be part of a team which is exciting, dynamic, delivering big results. So I think this kind of argument that somehow, like, all civil servants are, this weird term, the blob, rude, and also a bit rude, and also that they're kind of activists, I think that does the civil service, a great disservice, if you like. And I think if you're a smart minister and if you're a good special advisor, I'm sure you were a good special advisor when you were in the Home Office, you realise that having a good team which involves your civil servants is absolutely paramount to delivering stuff. And I think for all this bluster we hear from Dominic Raab that he was some titan of modern politics and he's going to be this huge loss to public life, what did he actually achieve? He wasn't around when the Afghanistan evacuation happened. He was famously still on holiday, said that the sea was closed. He presided over a disaster at justice. You said yourself the justice system is absolutely crumbling. There's so many things that went wrong. So I think this sort of culture war of just, having this massive fight and blaming the civil service for everything is really, really dangerous.
Can I just say, though, the difficulty is that the system is not set up well, right? If you were to go back, a minister goes into a department and they don't really know anybody there. The brief they are learning as they go on the job, and they don't have the power to hire or fire anybody that's there. So they are literally being dropped into this system without any sort of understanding of how it works. I mean, that's like a flawed way of kind of managing it. I totally take your point that actually you do need to help people learn how to be better managers, and in departments that they are not used to and that they don't know their way around, and that there is something on the other side of it as well, because even civil servants will say that the system isn't working as well as it should. That has got lots of multifaceted. One of them being that they had two huge shocks to the system, one being Brexit and the second being the pandemic. And there needs to be some kind of reappraisal, not in the kind of Dominic Cummings language of kind of like blowing it all up, but certainly even within the civil service, you will hear a lot of gripes about how things could work better.
Is there a resistance in the civil service towards specifically Conservative policies? Because it feels like this is the kind of accusation from Dominic Raab, that people just didn't agree with what he was doing, and that's why he met resistance.
Well, I think sometimes there is a frustration when you're on the political side of things, and I saw this being a special advisor, where your minister wants this department to deliver really quickly, and there's an issue about the scale of
the realism,
speed
basically,
and the reality, and also your minister's political career is hanging in the balance because people like you and us will be dissecting it on the airwaves. So they want things to be delivered. But the civil service is there to also make sure that ministers act within the parameters of the law, and also to make sure that things are realistic, that they're cost effective, and that they are within certain kind of rules. I mean, that's one of the great functions of British democracy, having this sort of civil service that is there, yes, to kind of aid and help ministers of all political hues, depending on who the government is, but to make sure that you are acting within parameters. And I just come back to this point, the best ministers and the best secretaries of state, yes, I do take your point, they go into new departments, they don't know people, but they know how to build teams. For example, I was an opponent of George Osborne, when I was working for Ed Miliband, but certainly people I knew at the Treasury said that actually he treated people really well at the Treasury. People had a lot of time for him. And I think it's not so much that civil servants are desperately morally against the things that have been done. A lot of the asks, and we know this because stuff has been challenged in the courts left, right and centre. You look at austerity, you look at how things have been cut. It's very hard for people to deliver when the kind of foundations aren't there, whether it's sort of money and resources and realistic expectations.
I've got to say, I don't think it's necessarily a Conservative issue, because I've definitely spoken to Labour and Lib Dem people who've had the same frustrations and the same problems that Dominic Raab has spoken about. So.
Interesting. We're entering local election territory, right, where the campaigning is ramping up. We're in the kind of campaign period. And I'm entering that slightly frustrating period with politicians where everyone was very, very on brand and on message, and there's a lot of expectation management going on, right? So getting a straight answer is hard. Ahead of the local elections, what are the Conservatives firstly going to be hoping for? And then I'll talk to you after.
So I think they're going to hope for sort of muted losses. I don't think there's any sense that they think that there's going to be kind of like a massive victory there. So you're right, the expectation management has absolutely begun. I think that if they are able to hold on to enough, they can say that actually this is just par for the course, a government that's been in a long time, and in the natural sort of way of things, that this is what the results have been.
I mean, there was talk about, at one point, about if it was a disastrous result, then Boris Johnson could be waiting in the wings, waiting to take over. Has that now disappeared?
So my sense from people that I'm speaking to is that it's not really going to be the moment that they all decide that something's going to change. Now, there might be some kind of plan of action with Boris loyalists and Boris people, but whether there is enough of an audience who want to listen to that, I think that's been quite diminished. I think people just wanted a period of calm so that they can actually build up to go towards the general election. And Aisha and I were discussing this earlier. It is a big electoral test for both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So I suppose the stakes are quite high.
Yeah, stakes high for Starmer as well, right?
It is interesting because this is it's going to be a sort of key test, probably the last set of elections, possibly before we have the next general election. So this is really important pitch rolling, and the narrative that both sides will be scrambling to establish, after the results are really, really important. I mean, the Conservatives are doing the classic management, they're like, we're going to lose 1 billion seats. And it's kind of like
more seats than there are.
Yes, exactly. Like every seat in the country we're going to lose. So there's that kind of thing. But what's going to be interesting is for Labour. I think Labour, again, muted is a good word. I think Labour Labour will be hoping for, they'll be kind of briefing sort of muted expectations. I think they'll be definitely hoping to win seats. I think the difficulty for Labour is going to be, you know, how big is that number going to be? And if it's not past a certain threshold. I mean, what's also going to be interesting is, and we don't talk about these, it's going to be interesting to see how the Liberal Democrats do and the Greens do, because often in these local elections, you know, there's lots of people, particularly in that blue wall area, where I think a lot of people could go Liberal Democrat or Green. So I think they're going to be really interesting as well.
And I guess the SNP may be quite relieved that there aren't any in Scotland, right?
The SNP is having another torrid week. You know, we saw the Treasurer, Colin Beattie, have to stand aside. You know, there was a big moment for Humza Yousaf to try and reset things, but of course the whole thing is dominated by yet more arrests. I mean, it's not good when you're the First Minister and you have to say, yes, I was surprised when one of my colleagues was arrested. And
it was a surprising thing.
Yes, it was. And we are not a criminal operation, you know. So I think, you know, he's trying to do these resets, and then there's the spectre of more arrests hanging over. And of course, now there are rumours swirling around that there will be, you know, potentially even Nicola Sturgeon might be called in for questioning as well. So there's still that huge moment of anxiety for the SNP. We learn as well that the party still owes Peter Murrell money as well. So it is a really tough time. And of course, there was an opinion poll this week which shows that support for the SNP has dropped to the lowest level since 2014. So all of this scandal is really doing a lot of damage to this very new First Minister. And it feels like the kind of sins of the fathers and the mothers that went before him are hanging over him now.
Difficult start, isn't it, for the new leader?
Incredibly difficult. And actually, I don't see how he comes back from this, because there is, as you say, there was an attempt to relaunch it, sort of putting out his vision for his leadership, but it seems to be completely ignored. And how does one actually navigate when there's always going to be these stories and this thing hanging over him? I don't think it's possible for him to have a successful run at this.
Wow, big difficulties there. Really interesting to talk to you both and get your analysis. We'll speak to you very soon indeed. Well, that's it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. But in a moment after the break, we're going to be running through today's interviews and having a chat with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello, welcome back. You are watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take, a chance to look back at our interviews this morning on the programme and try and work out what we've learned, what it means for the week ahead. Now, it's an interesting week because when Oliver Dowden was first confirmed as being on the programme, he had one job title. That changed within 24 hours. And it was while we knew that he was on the programme, that it got upgraded to Deputy Prime Minister, because he, close ally of Rishi Sunak, was told that he was going to be stepping into the shoes of Dominic Raab, another minister who had to resign over a scandal, a difficulty, of course, after the reports into his behaviour as minister and his actions towards the civil service. Is this something that is going to stick to Rishi Sunak ahead of those all-important local elections, or will people perhaps take a bit more of a nuanced view? Well, we can try and find out this morning. We're going to look back at some of our interviews. We're also joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, to try and have that discussion. Sam, lovely to have you, as always. What did you make of the Oliver Dowden interview?
Well, it's good to get him 3 days into the job. Oliver Dowden might not have the highest profile of any cabinet minister, although I think that's rapidly changing. But he is at the heart of Rishi Sunak's operation, arguably even closer to Rishi Sunak than his ex-Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. He oversees the election kind of preparations. He's overseeing the relations with the civil service. As a cabinet office minister, he's been at the heart of what the Prime Minister's trying to do. So what Oliver Dowden says is key. And what I was watching out for in that interview was basically whether the right-hand man of the Prime Minister agreed with Dominic Raab that he was treated unfairly, that there's a big problem at the heart of the civil service, or not. And he didn't. So there's this, as you have been talking about, this is effectively this culture war. Is the civil service fit for purpose? Is the civil service politically resistant to conservative ideas of the sort that were being pushed by Dominic Raab when he was Secretary of State for Justice? Or is it something a little less confrontational, and the sort of the circumstances around Dominic Raab perhaps just a little bit more unique to him? And for all the warm words about Dominic Raab, Oliver Dowden didn't effectively agree with him. I thought the nuance, the fact that he didn't say there was a big problem with the civil service, the fact that he said that he could get them to do what he wanted, was very significant, but whether or not it'll dampen down the Tory row over all of this, I'm not sure. But certainly it doesn't look like Rishi Sunak and his new number 2 want to lean into it.
You're right. Let's have a listen, shall we, to what Oliver Dowden said, because as Sam was saying, it did look like he was carefully trying to support the civil service. Let's listen.
I didn't live Dom's experience. I've served both as an advisor in the past and for a number of years as a cabinet minister. I've always found that if you give clear instructions to civil servants, of course you can have frustrations, and believe me, I've had my frustrations as well. But I've also seen, for example, I think that at the height of the COVID crisis, when all of our theatres were locking down, my civil servants worked relentlessly with me.
That was Oliver Dowden's take. I put the same thing to Jonathan Ashworth, asking him how concerned we should be that a senior cabinet minister is talking about civil servants in that way. Let's listen.
There's no problem with being demanding or inquisitorial or pushing the system hard. I want to be the Work and Pension Secretary. I want to be demanding and push the system to get people into good, well-paid jobs, to lift children out of poverty, to help the disabled people, 1 million extra disabled people in poverty. I want to push hard and be demanding to give pensioners security. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the report found that Dominic Raab was intimidating, aggressive, and it's not just that he was a bullying minister, he was also a failing minister.
So that was the takes of our 2 main guests on the programme this morning. Let's bring Sam back in, shall we? Does this mean this is all going to kind of go away now, or is it something that's going to keep rumbling on?
I think it'll keep rumbling on. I mean, notice what was going on there, playing those 2 little excerpts of the interviews back to back. In effect, they are in agreement. Neither individual, neither the Conservative Deputy Prime Minister nor the Labour Shadow Cabinet Minister wanted to say that there's a politicised civil service that is fighting the agenda of ministers, and that is just quite interesting. But you have a sort of a part of the Conservative Party looking forward and trying to prosecute this argument. And one of the reasons that they're able to do that is, if I'm being completely honest, Sophie, we spent all day on Friday picking over this report into Dominic Raab's behaviour by Adam Tolley, is that while it may have been legally very sound, politically it was the most unsatisfactory document, because politically, I think, whether it's the Prime Minister or the public, you wanted some clarity, but it was very, very nuanced, whether it was on the behaviour of Dominic Raab, which at some points intimidated people or left them feeling intimidated, but made clear that he wasn't intending to intimidate and he wasn't picking on individuals, even if individuals felt that they were being bullied. And also pointed to perhaps some things on the civil service side that might point to coordination to try and work against him. All of this means the picture is very muddy and allows all sides to do it. Because what I really think about the Dominic Raab affair is that there have just been questions about how he conducted himself for years, Sophie, and I think it's very hard to reflect that in a legal document. But I was reading 45 minutes ago when I popped up earlier that excerpt from the very well-regarded historian Anthony Selden, who talked about civil servants in Number 10 being warned about Dominic Raab's behaviour ahead of him coming in 2010 to step in for Boris Johnson, and that kind of red flag around a culture in his office of being problematic, that seeped through to the likes of you and me for a very long time. And the question is this just a government that, when it knows that there's a problem, but perhaps it hasn't got it down in black and white, the nose of the Prime Minister just wrinkles and leads them to go, maybe I won't put them in cabinet? Or is this a government that plays hear no evil and see no evil? And the most effective bit of your interview with Oliver Dowden was just putting a whole series of other things to him, whether it was whether or not they were right to appoint Richard Sharp, who perhaps got a bit too close to Boris Johnson, whether it's right for the Prime Minister to tell the monarch that Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley Johnson, should be elevated to the House of Lords. Worth pointing out, of course, that Boris Johnson's already put his brother in the House of Lords. All of these things, I think the wider accusation is, does this government just play a bit dumb when there are some politically inconvenient but nevertheless fairly big warning flags? And I think that's the question that Labour will be trying to capitalise on and is in the heart of politics at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. That was kind of what I was trying to do by layering those things together, by putting them together, because what it does is to give you a sense of this isn't just one thing where, look, there is a nuanced argument and you can hear both sides. It's if these things start layering up, then is there an overall impression, as you say, that this is a hear no evil, see no evil government. Well, look, we've got the elections coming up soon, so we'll try and find out a bit more about them. We'll have more from Sam in a moment, because we did talk a bit about those local elections on the programme. The Deputy Prime Minister himself telling me he thinks his party is going to lose around 1,000 seats in them. So that is a bit of expectation management going on. We heard from the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, as well. Let's have a little listen to what he says his focus is on these elections.
I think the Conservatives have let down our country very, very badly. That's what Conservative voters are telling us, whether it's on the economy, on the health service, or on the environment, for example. What I feel is that Liberal Democrats and all politicians, frankly, should respond to the electorate, make it clear where they stand on those issues, and not take voters for granted. I mean, in many ways, your question is taking voters for granted. And I'm not going to do that. I want to make sure that we earn people's vote over the weeks and months ahead, so at the next general election we can get rid of this a shocking government.
You probably saw my slightly quizzical face on screen there. It's always a bit weird seeing yourself back on TV, I have to say. And the reason I was looking a bit confused was because the question I was asking numerous times there was whether or not the Lib Dems would go into a coalition with Labour. And I wasn't really clear. Let's bring in Sam Coates at this time, shall we? How are the Liberal Democrats? And does it matter that they're not giving a straight answer to these things, or is it actually sensible politics?
So I actually thought that we learned quite a lot from the manner that Ed Davey dodged your question there. If you read between the lines, you know, the reason you were asking that question is that one of the completely possible outcomes from the next general election will be a hung parliament. And in the event that no party gets an overall majority, the MPs are going to effectively work together and vote on who they should make Prime Minister, which party should supply the person that goes in number 10. And there are all sorts of different ways that you can do that. And the Conservatives obviously tied up with the Liberal Democrats between 2010 and 2015, worked very well for the Tories, bit of a disaster for the Liberal Democrats in 2015, but that was a formal coalition. In other words, there was an agreement at the start that they stuck to amazingly all the way through, and there were some Liberal Democrat policy priorities that were delivered, and Nick Clegg was Deputy Prime Minister. And that model worked out really badly for the Liberal Democrats, which is, I think, why they're not jumping on the idea that they would do that again. But then there's a slightly more nuanced question, which is we've got to have a Prime Minister. The MPs have to work together. So if the Liberal Democrats were the swing voters in a parliament, would they back the Labour Party going in, or would they back the Conservative Party going in? And I think from the tone of Ed Davey, basically saying he was the party, his is the party to defeat the Conservatives, and using pretty punchy language, it's very hard to see a Ed Davey-led Liberal Democrat government, sort of party, after the next election, voting to put the Conservative Party in government, given everything that he's done. There wasn't much criticism of Labour. There was loads of very sharp criticism against the Conservatives. I don't think he could ever back them to go into power. One coda to all of that, in the 2019 election, many Liberal Democrat leaders ago, Jo Swinson tried to claim that she could be the Prime Minister herself, and that was an absolute disaster for the Liberal Democrats. Nobody believed her, and they had to abandon that strategy halfway through the election to the other option for him to say, which is, I'm going to be PM, probably not credible and not sensible. So hinting that he would put Labour in power without saying so, but making clear the Tories are the enemy, I think gives us a very clear steer where the Lib Dems might and how they might behave after the next election, depending on the numbers.
It's really interesting. And also, it matters for the elections coming up too, because there are an awful lot of those blue wall constituencies the Lib Dems will be targeting as well.
That's right. For Labour to do well, the Liberal Democrats need to do well as well. And you can see informally the country being divided up into areas where Labour are going to take on the Tories and areas perhaps in the south-east where the Liberal Democrats are going to take on the Tories. There are some areas where Labour and the Lib Dems fight it out, but that's the minority. And given that sort of sense of informal working, where people put resources into one or the other, but not both parties fighting the Tories doing that. I do get just the sort of outline of the country being divided up by two parties that want to kick out the Tories from number 10.
Really interesting. Well, if the Conservative Party are going to have any hope of doing well, not just at the locals, but also at the election next year, it's got to have something's going to have to happen with inflation. Now, we were joined on the programme by the Bank of England's former chief economist, Andy Haldane, and I thought it was quite interesting what he had to say about inflation. Let's listen.
The world's getting a bit better. Not loads better, but a bit better. It's getting its mojo back, and that will help us sell more of our stuff overseas. The big cause of that squeeze on living standards has been high inflation, as you mentioned. That will begin to head south pretty soon, probably starting next month, actually, and at a rate of knots.
Well, let's bring in our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, shall we? I mean, that's going to be good news, isn't it, for the Prime Minister, heading south soon at a rate of knots?
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate how important what Andy Haldane just said. The entire political outlook could change in a matter of months. Look, for all of the sleaze and the 13-year legacy of Tory-led government going back to 2010 that Labour are trying to capitalise on, in the end, the economics, who will put more money in people's pockets, who has been the better or would be the better steward of the economy, is perhaps the most important question in British politics. And how we feel now might be very different to how we feel in the start of 2024. And that's certainly what the Conservatives are hoping is the case. They hope inflation will be right down, they'll be able to deliver tax cuts, they'll be able to put money back in people's pockets, and then they might have a real shot at the next election. But it is not at all clear to me that people will be quite so forgiving. Inflation at 10% now means that so many things are so much more expensive than they were a year ago. There's no chance of prices going down, just the rate at which prices go up might slow a bit. So is there a wholesale change in the way that voters think about it, given that in the 2-year period that Rishi Sunak's been in power, things have gone up in cost so much. Food prices, of course, just under 20% higher than they are. But it's also a challenge for Labour because as politics changes, their arguments need to change as well. And I feel, listening to a lot of Labour politicians, that they're really still fighting as if Liz Truss was in number 10. They're highlighting the chaos, the economic mismanagement, the uncertainty around interest rates. And while that will have some purchase, people's mortgages are going to be more expensive, particularly if you were one of those tragically unlucky people that had to remortgage when the after effects of the Liz Truss mini budget were in place. I think at the same time they need to be able to present a much, much clearer picture. And to be honest, I'm getting a lot of concern from Labour figures that they haven't nailed the arguments, nailed the campaigning language, that they're not presenting a clear enough vision as well. So opportunities for both sides, but dangers for both sides, but just that sense that politics is going to be very different in 6 months' time means that people who confidently tell you they know what's going to happen in either May or October, or maybe even the following January, February or March, you just can't be sure.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, isn't it? It was so interesting listening to Andy Haldane saying that about interest rates coming down, or inflation rates, coming down at a rate of knots. And also saying that, look, Rishi Sunak's target to halve inflation, he described as nailed on. I mean, that was as confident as you could possibly get. But as Sam says, it's all about how people feel it in their pockets. Always good to talk, Sam. Sam there with his analysis on all the interviews of this programme, but also, of course, looking ahead to the week, because things are really going to be hotting up ahead of those local elections, votes in England and also in Northern Ireland. You can also listen to the interviews from the programme on our podcast, Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast, which should be available around lunchtime. That will be with myself, our editor, Scott Beasley, and also Jess Algott from The Guardian. That's it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take this morning. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We'll see you next week.